Alright, so this is part 8, if I can remember where I left off last. Oh, we went to a party that night, and we decided that we were gonna attempt to hook up. And so I didn't give it any thought at the time because I was just young, dumb, and stupid and all that shit. And he tried to make a move on me and kind of flipped me out a little bit. So afterwards, I didn't talk to him for a few days. I didn't text him. I didn't call him. I didn't talk to him. Well, a few days later, he calls me and says, hey, we need to talk. And so I was like, talk about what? And he's like, you know what I'm talking about. And I'm like, okay, what about it? And so he was like, I am the way I am. You should love me and you should, want this to basically happen. And I was like, well, I do want it to happen, but I'm a little nervous about it. And he was like, what do you mean? I was like, well, if it happens and something comes out of it, what are we gonna do? And he's like, I'll stay with you. I'm not that type of God to just do it and up and run. And I was like, okay, whatever. I didn't give it a lot of thought. Well, he had gotten an apartment in Addiston, and he has called me a day later and said, hey, I got this apartment with my 2 friends. You want to come over and see what happens? So I came over to the apartment, and we were hanging out, talking about us getting engaged, getting married, and all that stuff. Well, we got to drinking, and the next thing I know, we go in the bedroom, we close the door, and one thing leads to another, and he was like, are you sure that you're ready? I was like, yeah, I'm sure. And talk about being nervous for your first time. Yeah, that was really nerve-wracking. And for me, I'm not going to give out a lot of detail, but first time for that happening, I was really scared. I mean, it hurt, yeah, but it was weird how it all went down, because there was 3 different parts to it. And the first part, it hurt. I was a little sore and all that stuff. Well, he had got to a halfway on it. So then a few weeks later, we were talking. We were getting along. So he calls me back over to the apartment again, and we end up in the bedroom. One thing leads to another, and it happens again. And talk about hurting and painful. Yeah, it was really, really painful, but it had finally happened. And in that moment, I thought I could never get used to that and used to that pain. And when you're kind of sort of with a guy that's got a big badonkadonker, yeah, that's the worst pain for any girl. And one thing leads to another after that. We end up doing a lot of stuff. Then, we passed out. The next morning I wake up, and he looks over at me, and he says, well, how do you feel? I was like, I feel different. I feel wonderful. I feel just totally different. And he's like, yeah, I know. And I asked him, I said, how did you feel about it? And he's like, you allowing me to let that happen, he was like, that showed me that you are a really special girl, that you're really different, and that I could see myself having a future with you. And I was like, okay. And so I was over at the apartment for a couple of days. I had technically moved out of my grandparents' house. That was the summer I turned 18. And I was over there for a few days. I was kind of getting homesick. And me and him, we were kind of sort of not getting along. We were arguing and all that shit. And so I had called my grandparents. I asked them if I could actually be coming back home. And they said, yeah, come back home, everything and all that. So a few days later, I moved back home. And my grandma looked at me and said, did it happen? I was like, I tried to play it off at first. I was like, no, it didn't happen, blah, blah, blah. My grandma looks at me and goes, I know that it did because I could tell. And I'm like, oh, crap. And she was like, were y'all, safe about it? I was like, no, not really. And talk about having to admit something that embarrassing to your own parents. That was the worst embarrassing moment of my life. And on top of that, I had to go through a lecture, which I really didn't want to. And I had to get sat down for 2.5 hours and go through a motherfucking lecture. And talk about having the worst aggravating headache. That was the worst aggravating headache I've ever had in my life. And then a few days later, me and him get into this big ass fight. And I'm like, here we go again. And so stay tuned for part number 9.